The war in Ukraine has changed the world. And now we need to think about where this world is moving to, together. That's why MIM Business School is launching the nationwide educational project Reinforce UA, where the world's greatest minds will share their ideas and insights. And you will get their experience, change your perspective, and discover what changes should the business be ready for, before and after the victory. Every week on reinforceua.com.
Dear friends, colleagues in Ukraine and all over the world, I'm Vyacheslav Pokatila, and on behalf of First Ukrainian Business School MIM, welcome you on Reinforce UA project. This project was designed in order to inspire and enforce Ukrainian business community. And for this purpose, we invited the famous world intellectuals to share their views on most actual problems the world is facing now. And those problems which became especially important, taking into consideration the current war in Ukraine. The project was made possible due to the support of Bogdan Havrilishin Family Foundation and 3 business education associations, AACSB, AMBA, and IFMD. The project, we are very grateful for everybody who made donations on our website, and the funds raised will be directed to support of temporarily displaced Ukrainian women who want to start their own businesses. Before I shall give the floor to our guest, I'd like to remind you that you may ask questions by pushing Q&A button, and please do not use chat for this purpose. And that our meeting will be recorded, and video will be available further on our website, Reinforce UA project. And now I have the privilege to introduce our honorable guest, John Morrison, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Human Rights and Business, a global think tank that is well known to address globally challenges related to environmental and human rights issues. John has advised a number of businesses and governments in Ukraine and UN agency, and currently sits on the advisory council of 2 UK ministers, as well as the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. John Morrison is co-chair of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Human Rights in 2020-2022. He has a background in business, social anthropology, and international law. And in his most recent book, John Morrison claims that business needs social license in order to operate, and the lack of this license, or the problem with this license, could give rise to troubles and destruction of companies. Mr. Morrison, welcome. It is great that you agreed to share your views on Reinforce UA project. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and best wishes to everybody in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. I'd like to thank the MIM Business School in Kyiv for this opportunity. The Reinforce speaker series is very serious, it's very important. And as many of you are future business leaders operating in a context of the illegal invasion of Ukraine, conflicts, military coups, other types of economic shocks and climate change, biodiversity depletion, companies need executives and board members who understand these challenges, who can operate with ethical principles and with moral clarity. You will face many difficult decisions in your lives ahead, balancing the needs of people and planet, of business profit and wider societal welfare, and you'll need to fight all forms of corruption, discrimination, and the worst of all, inaction in the face of crimes and abuses. You won't always get it right, but the business leaders of the future will need to be equipped to do the very best they can. And now I'm going to just show you 1 or 2 pictures here. If I go on to shared screen, there we go. I hope that's, I hope everyone can see that okay. Let me just Okay. I'm just going to show this picture here now. I just, trying to progress my slides. Sorry. Yeah, I can't, for some reason, move my slides. I don't know why. I'm going to keep talking anyway, and do the best I can with the slides like this. The building, you'll see that at slide number 2, a very modernist building somewhere in Germany. And I think before we talk about the steps forward, we need to talk about, look back a little bit in terms of where we come from. Now, the building in the picture there was the 4th biggest company in the world in the late 1920s. It was a key driver of the European economy. It provided oil, benzol, sulfur, nickel, iodine, rubber, chromium, tungsten, nitrogen, and phosphates. It was seen as a very progressive employer. It had good working conditions. It met the standards of the time. In fact, when the National Socialists, the Nazis, came into power in Germany a few years later, they criticized the company for having too many Jews at senior management levels. Amongst the staff were also Nobel Prize winners, chemists, leaders in their field. The company was IG Farben, and it was a merger of BASF, Bayer, Agfa, and other companies who we know today even. And the question remains, even today, we debate this, how could a company that was so well respected in the late 1920s become, just within the space of 10 years, a company that was using prison camps in Auschwitz for forced labor, and yes, the company that developed the gas, Zyklon B, that was used to murder millions of Jews in the concentration camps. During the Nuremberg trials after the war, the IG Farben executives seemed in a state of denial about what had happened to their great company. How had it fallen so far? So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So what do we learn from history? What were the drivers behind the worst corporate complicity in the 20th century? Well, clearly, business leaders were driven by fear. We were in a context in the 1930s where the rule of law was not applied, or wasn't applied fairly. People were afraid to speak out or to do the right thing as the 1930s progressed. But that's not the only factor at play. There was also a lot of money on the table, particularly from 1936 onwards in terms of military procurement and other public contracts that came the way of IG Farben. But perhaps the biggest driver of all, according to historians, was the competitive instincts of the company itself. That if they didn't take what was on offer, their competitors would. And perhaps that was the biggest driver of all in terms of how the company, like a frog in water, was able to tolerate hotter and hotter water and never jumped out of the water. So moving on to the next slide then. What do these 3 critical issues, fear, opportunity, competition, if we think about business and human rights in this century, what are the 9 things that any business needs to think about to avoid being part of the problem and stepping forward to being part of the solution and tackling some of the big challenges that our planet has? And I just go through these quickly because I think they're all very relevant. The independence of the rule of law. Now, I mentioned already the corruption of lawyers and law was a big issue in Nazi Germany as the 1930s progressed. But this is an issue everywhere. We look at Rwanda, we look at Syria, we look at many places around the world without independent rule of law. Russia as well. There is a business case for the independence of the judiciary and good legal systems. And if businesses blow whistles and make a noise when they see corruption, when they see a legal abuse, it's in their long-term interest to do so, because the erosion of the rule of law, I would say, is one of the 9 key factors here. Civil society and human rights defenders, whistleblowers and whistleblower protections. It can feel painful as a company to listen to criticism and people who are trying to hold you accountable. But imagine a society where that's not possible. One of my colleagues undertook a research program for Amnesty International 20 years ago on the erosion of civil society within Russia. And then some of the business leaders from Russia said, don't worry, things are going to be fine. We know how to deal with this. And now we are where we are. And so there is a real business case for a vibrant and independent freedom of civil society, even if some of those human rights defenders are going to criticize you as a business. Also, the next point, freedom of expression and free speech. Businesses and workplaces are microcosms of society. People need to be able to speak with freedom of fear, regardless of who they are, regardless of their gender, their ethnic minority, their sexuality, their faith, or their class. Business needs to respect freedom of expression as long as it's not hate speech towards other employees. So do you allow staff and colleagues to speak truly freely in your workplaces? The fourth issue then is, of course, worker rights and collective bargaining, the International Labour Organization, core conventions. Some of them go back to the 1920s and the 1930s. And they're still the bedrock of business and human rights. We're still fighting forced labor 100 years later after the convention came into effect. And then the final of the five at the beginning here is zero tolerance of corruption. And I've mentioned this already. Corruption is no friend of human rights. In fact, it greases the wheels of human rights abuse. So zero tolerance of all forms of corruption, even if it's against the short-term interests of a company, is really important. Now, those are the 5 points looking backwards. And then the remaining 4 on the slide here, which is the remainder of my speech and maybe the discussion that we'll have, is what I think are the opportunities, the way that businesses can step up in difficult times. We need corporate cultures based on dignity and respect. The corporate responsibility to respect all human rights that was set out by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights agreed in 2011. Strong board governance, board oversight and duties relating to affected stakeholders. This is a new area. Very few boards yet have competence on social and environmental issues. And we'll come on, I'm sure, during discussion onto the issue of sanctions and whether sanctions themselves are a good driver for human rights. The next slide, please. So the first point then is about the fact that doing the right thing, human rights can't be left as a voluntary initiative. And for many years, we've talked about corporate social responsibility and the philanthropic gestures companies can make. There are big, important things companies in Ukraine and around the world need to be doing in terms of charity and raising money. I agree with that. But there's a baseline also that there needs to be a legally enforced responsibility on companies to respect rights. And so the European Union's current directive on proposing mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence for the 11,000 biggest companies within the European Union and then 3,000 companies outside of the European Union is a very important step forward. And why is that? Well, one initiative we set up a few years ago was the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. This measures the performance of several hundred of the biggest companies in the world. And you'll see if you read our reports that there's been a plateauing on performance. Only about a third of companies in different sectors seem to take the issue of human rights seriously, and they're making slow progress. The other 2/3 are either doing nothing and plateauing in the middle, or absolutely doing nothing and actually eroding human rights. So without a legal requirement to know and show, to undertake your due diligence, we will not move forward. So the European Commission's current proposal, which I think is now likely to become law in Europe in the years to come, and we already see it in France and Germany and some other jurisdictions, is really important. The next slide, please. Now, you mentioned kindly in the introduction my book on the social license, and this is a slide from the book. And when we think about navigating the global challenges, businesses need trust, they need legitimacy, and they need consent to step up in the way that we're talking about. And we used to talk about legal license of a company. We often talk about the political license from governments and voters and elites. But I would also contend then there's another corner to this triangle, what we could call the social license to operate. Businesses need to maintain that trust, that social contract with communities, with consumers, in order to step up in the way that we've decided around particular market opportunities, but also some of these challenges. And I think you see this concept of social license in wider conversations. It started in the mining sector, but I heard Mark Carney talk about it a lot in terms of the global financial sector after the financial crisis, and we're seeing it in other sectors too. The next slide, please. You also mentioned the role I've had co-chairing the Human Rights Council at the World Economic Forum. And this has really been the challenge that we decided to take on there, was how do we make this issue an issue for boards, for the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 women and men who actually have the fiduciary and legal responsibilities for a company, regardless how big the company is. Very few boards discuss human rights at the moment. Maybe they do now in the context of sanctions in Ukraine, etc. But still very few boards have the competence to know whether they're doing the right things or not. So we undertook a report. We hope the report will be in Ukrainian soon, that shows the different kinds of mechanisms companies can have to oversee different relations with affected stakeholders, whether they be workers, communities, consumers, or others. And I'd love, if any of you want to read that in English and hopefully in Ukrainian soon, to get your feedback, because very few companies really have the competence at board level yet. And I'm very pleased that in the European Union proposal, board oversight and director duties are still in the current draft. So soon, maybe board directors will be measured not just on the financial performance of a company, but also the environmental and social performance of that company. The next slide, please. So the final slide then is really some points that maybe we can pick up in discussion. On the sanctions issue, we have been big fans of Bill Browder's work on Magnitsky legislation, which we now see in the US, UK, Europe, Australia, and one or two other jurisdictions. These have been a forensic attempt to add names of individuals and companies to sanctions lists based on human rights criteria or violations of humanitarian law. What we've seen since the invasion of Ukraine is obviously sanctions that go well beyond that. Possibly you could even describe it as economic warfare. But this line between targeted sanctions and economic warfare and what the long-term versus the short-term consequences are is an active debate. And I think we'll probably get into that in a minute. Businesses need to understand what their obligations are now in relation to occupied territories, conflict areas. I know Professor Olena Uvarova's work on essential services in Ukraine is also very important. We have no international rules around issues like food, energy, provision, or health. Each time there's a conflict, the rules seem to be made up again. And of course, the blockade on the Ukrainian ports has an impact not just in Ukraine, but all around the world in some of the poorest countries. There's no Geneva Conventions for economic warfare, and I think this is a big need of the international community. As I've mentioned, human rights need to be pre-competitive. The basic of it has to be put into legislation. And as I've said also, I think this is an issue of board culture, board performance, board behavior, if you like. And the businesses should always maintain a case for an interest in of the rule of law, because I think regardless of short-term opportunities and interests, the erosion of rule of law will not be in the interest of business in the long term. So that's the end of the presentation. I'd like to thank you for this. Sorry for going back to the 1920s and 30s, but somehow I think we have to look back as we look forward, and I'm very happy to get into discussion now and also take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morrison. Let me start with the following question. You started your presentation with an example. An example of the German chemical company. Actually, we have now another big company known, not name it. And the result was that the company, both company, the managers of the company were prosecuted. they appeared on Nuremberg tribunal. Which could mean that business companies may face troubles and managers could suffer if neglecting human rights. So that was clear example, doing something wrong will be prosecuted. Then why it's still the issue? Why it's still many companies violating, and we have again and again examples of this type. Probably not so extreme like in Germany and during the Second War, but sometimes rather extreme, I would say. What's the reason, in your opinion? What is behind human nature? Just you want this?
I think the bar has been very high. I mean, obviously, the Nuremberg trials took place in a very concrete place and time, and there was a number of circumstances around it. We now have the International Court, Criminal Court, but very few business leaders have been investigated in relation to international crimes because the bar is very high there. However, there have been a number of prosecutions, quite a few actually, under national law relating to international crimes, business involvement in forced labor, for example. And now the Dutch law that has just come in puts criminal sanctions on the boards of companies in relation to child labor, the worst forms of child labor, if these things take place in their supply chains. So I think the bar has been high in terms of international crimes. But as I mentioned, the impact of this European Union proposals around mandatory due diligence, although that's not criminal law, you might see some countries now bringing forward administrative law or the possibilities for civil law cases against companies for not undertaking adequate due diligence, i.e. so they don't actually have to abuse human rights. They just, if the company is behaving in a very negligent way and putting people at risk, that will be the threshold for civil cases. And the absence of transparency and reporting might be the basis for administrative cases. You might see companies losing public procurement opportunities or export credit opportunities as well. So ironically, although we're talking about trials in Nuremberg that took place 70, 80 years ago, the legal manifestation of businesses in relation to human rights is only a discussion of now. I don't think there's been political will. And as you know, the past 30, 40 years, we've been going through a period of economic liberalism where there hasn't really been much of a will to do this. But I think you're seeing it now. The vote in the European Parliament for this current legislation was, I think it was 87% of MEPs voted for it from the left and the right. So we're living in unusual times. And this is before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where you'll see much stronger appetite to hold businesses accountable for serious violations. Yeah.
Well, but you mentioned this economic liberalism, and you use the term pre-competitive.
Yeah,
that's important term. Let's say just recently there was a scandal, mostly in USA, but also not in Europe, regarding this ESG, environmental and social governance issues, and it's greenwashing became not only the marketing term, but become also the term which is associated with money laundering and something like this, money washing.
Yeah.
I didn't hear about some really critical about CSR practice. Sorry, but nevertheless, these companies are more competitive or less competitive, because it looks like in the short term they're losing money, and therefore your term to be this to consider this before competition is rather important. But how to convince, how to bring this idea that this is important at all, because liberal idea is still dominating in many countries. Of course, there are a lot of discussions now, but there's a common sense that business exists for making profit. Forget about anything else.
And sometimes we have to wait for disasters to happen before there's enough appetite to make things pre-competitive. Let's take the example of the factory fires in Bangladesh. Nearly 10 years ago, I think now, the collapse of the factory, Rana Plaza, 1,100 people died, mainly women in that. before that factory collapse, the issue of health and safety in those factories was pre-competitive. You basically did things as cheaply as you could. You bribed officials. You didn't worry about the integrity of the building or the fire and safety of the women working there. What's happened since the collapse, and I acknowledge the role of Chancellor Merkel and others in the leadership following that, is you have a number of initiatives on the ground now involving trade unions, involving international brands, to make the issue, and the Bangladeshi government, of course, of the very basic worker rights and health and safety in those apparel factories pre-competitive. So it makes things a bit more expensive. But like with IG Farben, the biggest eroder of corporate culture at IG Farben was this idea that competitors would win contracts and would undermine them in other markets. So businesses seem to be able to go a long distance in the wrong direction unless we're clear that some issues are not competitive issues. So I think ESG, there's a danger that ESG becomes the new CSR. There's a lot of greenwashing. There's a lot of environmental approaches like TCFD and these other things that have no social component at all. We need a bedrock, and that bedrock has to be law and it has to be pre-competitive. Otherwise, social standards will continue to get eroded. I think the European Union legislation, therefore, is really important, and the fact that it will affect a lot of non-European companies as well. But we need more of that.
Law is a little bit shaky field for me. I will try to avoid it, but you mentioned this several times, and also mentioned the law, Dutch law, Netherlands.
Yes.
And also you referred to red flags, which companies should somehow not to cross. Red flags or red lines are becoming quite famous term. So among these red flags, if I look at this Norwegian NGO site, there are the following: handling questionable assets, making illicit payment. I just selected a few out of 11 as far as I could get. Providing the means to kill, which means company will supply weapon or something to result in atrocity, may face prosecution. Investing in occupied territories sounds very actual, very fresh for if I may use this term in situation of Ukraine. What is probability, and how would you assess the possibility for Russian individuals or companies and entities to face this kind of prosecution, let's say in Netherlands or in other European country?
No, that's a good question.
But please remember that just recently, haven't finished yet, was a prosecution and 4 years long process regarding much more obvious case of MH117 in Netherlands as well. So I'm not sure if it will end with this, because it is a lot of evidences and how to bring this to the court. Yeah.
I do think we'll see more cases. I mean, the issue of business in occupied territories is not a new issue. So for those of us who want to think about the issue of Russian occupation of Ukraine and what businesses should or shouldn't be doing, we need also to look at the issue of Palestine and the issue of Western Sahara, possibly also Tibet, other places around the world that are deemed to be occupied, and what rules and laws have been developed there. I mean, clearly, the occupied territories in the West Bank and Israel and Palestine, there's been a lot of attention to that over years, right? And part of that is law. There have been cases in some jurisdictions of companies that have breached sanctions or have the directives of their own governments. But there's also been boycott campaigns that have been targeted certain companies for being in occupied territories as well. I think it's very early. I'm not the expert on the issue, and I don't think anybody yet wants to accept that the areas of Ukraine that are currently occupied will remain so, right? So it's we hope this not become a permanent situation as it has in some other places around the world. But there is learning in other places around the issue of business in occupied territory. And that I would say would be a lecture in itself. Maybe you could have an expert on that issue come and speak to you, because I think that's it's going to become an increasingly relevant issue for you. Yeah. I think you're on mute, or is it me? I can't hear, sorry. You're on mute, I think.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button. The question from those who at the moment participate in online webinar: what criteria do you particularly see to differentiate between between this greenwashing, I use this, and genuine? And speaking about, let's say, for example, ESG practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always useful when the financial markets come up with a concept like ESG, which opens the door to conversations. And I was at COP26 in Glasgow, where business was all over the place, talking about how business would be part of the solution in terms of climate change, including the oil and gas companies and others. How do you distinguish whether they're serious or whether it's just greenwashing? You really have to look at what they're committing themselves. Well, two things. One is what are they publicly committing themselves to? Net zero by 2050, halving emissions by 2030, etc. But then you have to look at the numbers. You have to look at capital allocation and look at the balance sheets. Look at what they're telling investors to see whether they're actually moving the company in a direction to meet those targets. And then I think you can cut through the greenwashing, because I think there is even within the same company some people who are serious about environmental and social issues, and others who see it as purely a PR or marketing ploy or a distraction from the day-to-day of making business. So that fight is fought out even within the same company and between companies. But I think with transparency, the same transparency that UNFCCC has created around measuring carbon, so that we're beginning to agree on the rules of scope 1, 2, and 3, measuring the emissions not just of countries but of companies and their supply chains. We can do the same for social. That's why we developed the corporate human rights benchmark 6 or 7 years ago, because the question I get asked the most is, who are the good companies and who are the bad companies? I mean, I get asked that question every day, and it should not be a subjective answer. We need an objective answer to that question. And so the metrics we created around the corporate human rights benchmark are partly based on the intention and the public commitment of the company, but also the performance, and not what the company says about itself, what the media says, what communities and NGOs are saying about that company, and how many serious allegations the company has, and how it's settled those, what remedies has it provided for those serious allegations. You can do it. John Ruggie, Professor John Ruggie, the architect of the UN Guiding Principles, who unfortunately died last year, always used to say to companies, you can navigate 200 tax codes around the world. Sure, you can measure human rights, It's just an issue of will. We have technology, we have data sourcing, big data. There are many ways in which we can measure performance of governments and companies. And I think we will move over the years ahead. Most workers and communities have cell phones in their hand. There is, even in repressive countries, much more transparency about what's really going on. I think we're going to move to a reality a bit like we have on climate change, where we are beginning to talk about measurable data around the performance of companies and governments in human rights terms. So I do think technology is going to help us. Blockchain and other immutable sources of data will help us create more transparency around supply chains and business. Yeah.
It immediately reminds me of the American proverb, information kills, data kills, but I'll come back to this in a minute. So we have another question from the audience. Always, for me personally, is a bit difficult, but it's usually the argument. And it was anonymous attendee, and I will read it. Considering the modern society is moving towards responsible consumption, let's say, assuming this, and trying to avoid company with problematic reputation, let's say, assuming that responsible consumption, assume not to buy cheap products from unreputable companies. Do you think there might be a trend for companies to lose money in the short term but stand for human values and profit in the longer terms. Usually, it's a foundation to let's say somehow encourage companies again to think in terms of profit. So not pre-competitive, but to compete in a longer term by means of complying, in particular with human rights, which is the idea quite common and commonly discussed in World Economic Forum as well. Could you comment, please? Is everything okay in your heads with this kind of argument, or you still feel the trouble? Because I always feel trouble at this, I personally.
I used to work in a company 20 years ago for the Body Shop. I don't know if you have that in Ukraine, but a natural cosmetics company that still goes now. But Anita Roddick, the CEO, founded the company in 1976, and she was one of the first CEOs on the planet to engage in these issues, human rights, but also no animal testing and also environmental issues. And we always had this discussion the whole time, because when we measured our consumers in 50 markets around the world, only about 10% of those consumers, even in the most ethical markets, like the German consumers, for example, were walking into the shop purely driven by the human rights performance or the environmental performance of the company. So the positive correlation was weak. But of course, if you had an expose in the newspaper that said there was child labor in the supply chain, then the same customers say they wouldn't shop there again. So the negative correlation is much stronger. But it's very complex for consumers. And I do think eventually we will be able to bring consumers into this, and we have to. And consumers and investors, remember, our pension plans, etc., many of us are also investors as well as consumers, will begin to reward companies who are doing the right thing over the medium to long term. I think on the environmental side, on climate, that's already happening. I mean, investors are dumping coal assets very quickly around the world. Very hard for coal companies to get international financing or investment these days. That will extend on other environmental and biodiversity issues. And I think if we can get the metrics, I know you're not a big fan of data, it sounds, but I do think in business, the only things you really move on are things that are measurable, and you can create metrics around human rights. And I think the corporate human rights benchmark is an early attempt to do that. It's a long way from being the kind of data that consumers can use when they go shopping. It would be great if we could just scan the barcode on a product and find out some kind of rating around the human rights and the supply chain. But we live in a world where commodities that go into our products go all over the world, and there are big black boxes of certainly either at the beginning of a supply chain or in the middle. Of copper, let's take copper as an example. It's dug out of the ground in Latin America and Africa, but 51% of the world's copper goes to China for smelting and then comes back out of China to build our infrastructure in our cities. So we have hugely complex supply chains, and there are many sort of gray areas or black areas in those supply chains. The way that commodities are traded, very few of these commodities are traceable. I mean, diamonds are traceable, but most commodities are traded on a mass balance basis, percentage in of ethical goods versus percentage out. So you might not be buying the same soya beans or coffee beans or palm oil that is actually ethically grown, but you are, as a consumer, part of that percentage. It's like when you buy renewable energy from the main grid, you're not getting green electrons, you're getting a percentage commitment of green energy into the grid, and you're taking that out. So that's what makes it very tricky. Unless you're buying a big diamond, if any of us were rich enough to buy a big diamond, then they can say that exactly which mine that's come from, and every single person that's handled that diamond and the working conditions of every person between the diamond mine and you. But we're a long way from doing that for other commodities. But I do think things like blockchain will enable us to do that over the years ahead, and that kind of data will be delivered into the hands of consumers and investors. And then above the pre-competitive space is a competitive space, and that will enable companies to compete on these issues in the medium to long term. So I think it's coming, we're just not there yet.
It's a long way. Just to clarify your opinion, it's a long way because of complexity of the issue. Or it's a long way of complexity
and will, right? I mean, I think.
And will.
Yeah, I think, as John Ruggie said about the tax codes, right? If there was enough will there, but political will and business will, we would move much more quickly to getting through the complexity. So it's a combination of will and complexity. Yeah.
And by the way, I'm in favor of measuring, and I like data. I would be suspicious about any data without proof how it works and what is behind. And you several times mentioned this benchmark and measuring compliance with human rights rules and or flags, lines, and Institute for Human Rights and Business actually provides this kind of a benchmark. And I had a look. And found, of course, first of all, I was interested in Russian companies, and I found that Russian Rosneft, famous Rosneft, managed and governed, you mentioned Magnitsky in your presentation, as a company which is directly related to this case. Rosneft was measured, and the score was 10 of 26, quite poor, very poor. So I was happy until found that Canadian Natural Resources measured 8 from 26. And immediately saw in my mind, the manager of Rosneft presenting to the staff and to public that, they are much better than Canadian Natural Resources Company, which somehow troubled me. The challenge you took, to measuring whatever, and the output, the result, is enormous. I mean, in both sides, because this can be used as a propaganda. So, in my opinion, Rosneft shouldn't appear in this list at all. You had measured probably some company in Rwanda for that or another reason. I can't remember. So could you somehow?
I'll tell you something about that.
Enormous challenge to do it, to collect all this data, to work out all this data. Enormous money. So it is not a matter of just small rank. That's my opinion.
No, I agree, and I think the corporate human rights benchmark, when you should look at all the percentages. I don't know which indice the 26 was that just oil and gas companies, or was that a particular? Because normally there was a percentage out of 100 for each of the companies. Most Russian companies were very low. I mean, I have to say. The aim is to do it for all the 500 biggest publicly listed companies in the world. So we're not going to exclude Chinese companies or Russian companies, whatever. It's tried, it's objectively, they're publicly listed and therefore they get included. But it's true also that some American companies score very low because they don't have good labor rights protections, either directly in the US or in their supply chains. They might score higher on other things. But the majority of the companies who do best are indeed European. Some are North American, but some are Brazilian. Some are in Southeast Asia. It's becoming more complex than saying that just all the European companies are great and all the Asian or global South companies are bad. It is interesting, which I know some global South companies that are taking this very, very seriously now. So it should never be seen that this is, and sometimes when you travel around the world, you hear this is an OECD club, right? This is to keep emerging economies out of the global marketplace. The OECD just keeps putting all these additional social and environmental hurdles for you to jump before you get into the elite club of the OECD. And I think we really must tackle that and challenge that. I will say the methodology around the corporate human rights benchmark is ongoing. It gets better every year. We had to learn from big disasters like the Rio Tinto disaster in Australia or the Vale disaster in Brazil. Companies that were actually taking human rights quite seriously had big disasters, and so they then go down. There's no such thing as a company that is immune to the abuse of human rights, even with good systems. And I mean, I don't want to compare those companies with IG Farben, but let's remember that IG Farben in the late 1920s was the best place to work. You know, Nobel scientists, a diverse workforce, etc. So companies can change quickly. I do think moving forward, we need a philanthropist to put billions of dollars on the table and to create an open source big data solution to performance of governments and companies on human rights. You're beginning to see this in the invasion of Ukraine with satellites and military, people disclosing evidence of atrocities on the ground. I've begun to see this in West Africa around oil leaks from tankers and things. This data gets shared publicly. Workers, as I said, there are apps on phones for workers to report violations in factories all over the world now. If we can bring all this data together, we will, and I'm sure we will, arrive at a much more robust data set for making those kind of decisions and rewarding the companies who are taking it seriously and penalizing those who are not. I just think we're a few years away. I think the will is getting there now. We need the finance. As you say, it's going to be very expensive, but once you've done it once, you can crowdsource a lot of the data moving forward, I think. Yeah.
Well, I wish you success. And Ukraine, by the way, is joining OECD. So in this respect, we could also probably businesses in Ukraine would also we will be under this screening and under this, from both sides, Ukraine and NGOs, European NGOs screening of how we deal with human rights. Next year, there will be certainly a lot of events celebrating 75th anniversary of Universal Declaration of Human Rights of UN. And I assume that you will personally probably speak on some of these events or several events. Could you bring us to the future 1 year? What will be the key words, the key message? What will be the key idea you would somehow emphasize on this event? Additionally, to know how great we are and what kind of progress we need progress.
And I'm not Mr. Gutierrez. I'm not the Secretary General of the United Nations, and I'm not the High Commissioner for Human Rights either, who will be making the formal presentations. But clearly, I have ideas. My founding chair, Mary Robinson, is a former president of Ireland, but also former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And she would always quote Eleanor Roosevelt, who, of course, had a big role in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. I mean, she is often seen as the person that pushed the experts together between 1945 and 48 to come up with the Universal Declaration. I mean, thank God. I mean, and the Universal Declaration is a reaction to those first slides I showed around IG Farben and the Holocaust in Nuremberg. What is it that we have to put out there that might prevent us going down that path again as a society? And human rights are not perfect. They've grown a little bit over the past decades. We've had many conventions come forward on particular issues, but they're still there. Economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights, indivisible from each other, unalienable. You can't take them away from people. Even if somebody has committed a crime themselves, they still have some basic rights there. That's an unpopular issue. So human rights are not always popular. They're not popular in my country, the UK, because everybody thinks I'm talking about asylum seekers or prisoners or, not me. People feel that human rights is always the other person and not there. What about my human rights is something you often hear. So I think then the challenge for next year in the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration that was signed in the Palais de Chaillot in Paris on the 10th of December, 1948, is that issue of it is me. It is all 7.5 billion people on this planet have some stake in the future of human rights. It's not something that's been imposed on their culture by some post-Second World War elite. It's not the rights of the victors over the rights of the defeated. It's not the rights of the powerful over the powerless. The critical thing, and I'd say for the future of the planet and the future of humanity, is that we all feel that we have some stake in the future of our world, and that there is a purpose in putting forward a code, an ethical code for humanity that at least perhaps raises some awareness of those steps that will lead us into genocide again. And I know your country's living this at the moment, so I'm very respectful of that. But I tried to, in my presentation, go through those 9 different areas that a business can look at. I think we know from experiences all around the world over the past 75 years what that slippery slope to genocide and mass extermination and mass human rights abuse looks like. Let's just make sure we share that knowledge with the 7.5 billion people on the planet. And that would be my hope for next year. Yeah.
Continuing with this declaration, we have also another question from the audience. Don't you think that declaration needs to be somehow updated? Let's assume that UN initiated the new discussion about what to change, and let's assume that all states' representatives voted for a new, updated, new declaration. In your opinion, it will be a longer document, shorter document? What needs to be added or what needs to be removed?
I worry it would be a very short document indeed. if we reopen that discussion.
Hold on. Also a possibility to hide everything, in a long, a little bit vague document.
In Italian, che non c'è, there's nothing inside the blue covers. I think a lot of people would fear that the consensus of 1948 is not we don't have that consensus today. I'll challenge this idea that it's not being updated. It is being updated. What's happening is that the Universal Declaration is being sort of clarified by conventions, but also by resolutions of the General Assembly in New York. So 10 years ago, water became a human right. You won't find water, the right to water, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You'll find the right to health. And so it's an elaboration of the right to health that then created a vote that was led by the Bolivian and German governments 10 years ago. And there was a majority. So water is now internationally recognized as a human right. We have a similar process at the moment for the rights to a healthy environment. There was a vote in the Human Rights Council, and now literally, I think it's coming up, a vote, unless I've missed it, in New York around the right to a healthy environment. That might then become a human right. So there is a process internationally for rights to become internationally recognized. You don't have to reopen the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights. And I don't think we need to, because I think Eleanor Roosevelt said, we need these rights in the office, we need them on the farm, we need them in the workplace. She herself always had this vision that these rights are not just for lawyers, not just for governments, they're for all of us. So it's the spirit of the Universal Declaration that I think we need to reconnect with. I think there's room for everything in the right. I don't think we have to reopen the 1948 Declaration at all, and I think it would be dangerous to do that at a time of global tension. Yeah.
Then another idea, where we are trying to be somehow like business-oriented people to be inventive or innovative. Another idea is, as I'm reading from the audience, we're speaking about rights, human rights, and then there is a responsibility to respect human rights. But could it be, let's say, to have human responsibilities or some kind of a list of human responsibilities or commonly agreed approach to this? And the Ukrainian parliament adopted National Day of Human Responsibilities. Should it be somehow generalized for the whole world and somehow put into wording appropriately? What's your attitude to this idea?
I think it's a good idea. I think this is something that's progressed as well. Originally, it was only states that governments protected human rights. and respected them too, and fulfilled them. As individuals, as non-state actors, we had no responsibilities in relation to human rights ourselves. It was all with government. But the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights took a very, very important step there by saying non-state actors, i.e. business, also have a direct responsibility to respect rights, even if a government is not protecting them, even if there's no government, even if government's 1,000 kilometers in that direction and you're operating a mine and there is no effective government, you still, as a non-state actor, as a business, have a responsibility to respect human rights. And I think that's the beginning of a discussion around the responsibilities we all have for our planet, for each other, for ourselves. Some governments have pushed this. I'm glad you have this discussion in Ukraine. I see it in some other countries too, this idea of personal responsibility. I think it's good if it's done if it doesn't, it's not an excuse for governments to give up its fundamental duties. But we do have responsibilities towards each other, and we should have freedom, but our freedom is constrained by the way we impact on other people. So no one has absolute rights. We all have to respect each other, of different cultures, of different backgrounds. And I think this issue of personal responsibility is really important. So that's a conversation I'd love to have again. Yes, I'm very, very interested in what's happening on that.
Then about personal responsibility, and normally, or naturally, I would say, not normally, but naturally, those who are more powerful, smarter, whatever, in any respect, should have probably more responsibility. And I checked that the richest person at the end of 19th century was Andrew Carnegie. I was lucky because, MIM Kyiv has a cooperation with Carnegie Mellon University. And Andrew Carnegie is known to say, the man who dies rich, dies disgraced. The richest person at the end of 20th century appeared to be Bill Gates, also a known philanthropist, whatever. And then the question is, it is a normal, as a practice among the wealthiest people, let's say people with high morale, in your opinion, or it's just a coincidence?
I guess they look at themselves in the mirror. Look, I'm a big fan of Andrew Carnegie for two reasons. He was Scottish, which is always a good thing. And he built lots of libraries. I don't know if he built libraries in Ukraine. He built libraries in my country and many other places in America and Europe. And so he really believed in public education, right? He really, and Bill Gates too, I think has been relatively wise with his philanthropy. I don't think I think what you're getting at though is that enough? And I think the question, if we just turn to Elon Musk or a company like Facebook, or these companies have a lot of power, right? They might not be a government. They might not have elections and they might not have the same duties as a government does. But they have more responsibility than you and I do because of the nature of the power they possess. So fundamentally, human rights is about power. And the greater the differential you have between the powerful and those that have no power or agency at all, the more vulnerable they are to having their rights abused. That's clear. So we do, and there are many initiatives underway to think about other forms of accountability that are maybe not the traditional legal forms of accountability where governments use criminal or civil law, but there are other ways perhaps that internet companies, global sporting companies like FIFA or the IOC, who need to be independent of government, but also need to be accountable. There are very interesting ideas about different ways of actors being held accountable to each other and to the law, different types of law. So I think, for me, fundamentally, it's about power and accountability. And you're right. Even if you're Bill Gates or Andrew Carnegie, you still need to be accountable because of the power you have. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have more questions, but not enough time to address all the questions. And also, beg my pardon, in front of the audience for those questions which we missed. It's time for us to go somehow to complete. And I have a great pleasure to thank you, Mr. Morrison, for participation in this discussion. We actually touched quite a difficult issue, for business difficult, for society difficult, I mean society worldwide and in Ukraine in particular. And your expertise and your active position in this field is of course very valuable, and thank you very much.
The war in Ukraine has changed the world, and now we need to think about where this world is moving to, together. That's why MIM Business School is launching the nationwide educational project Reinforce UA, where the world's greatest minds will share their ideas and insights. And you will get their experience, change your perspective, and discover what changes should the business be ready for, before and after the victory. Every week on reinforceua.com.